Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Today we're talking about minimum wage in Pennsylvania. But first, we're joined by Jackson White, State House reporter with LNP and Lancaster Online. Welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Jackson, you filed a story about Sunday hunting in Pennsylvania. What step did lawmakers take just last week?
Yeah, so on June 11th, the State House passed a bill sponsored by Representative Mandy Steele from Allegheny County that would lift the statewide ban, the longtime statewide ban on Sunday hunting. Right now, it's sort of unclear what will happen in the Senate. Last year, the Senate passed a similar version of this bill, but the House wasn't able to pass it before the session expired. So right now, it's sort of a wait and see what the Senate will do next. They return to Harrisburg next week.
Jackson, let's take a step back on this issue. What was the original idea, anyway, behind not permitting Sunday hunting?
So the idea, I think, this law has been on the books since 1873. Very old bill, or very old law. It allows for hunters to go after foxes, crows, and coyotes, but nothing else. No other game in Pennsylvania. No turkey, bear, deer, what we consider common game here. So I think the idea there was to allow farmers a day of sort of rest from having hunters on their lands. And I think there's a lot of religious motivation there too, to give people a day to attend church with their families.
So how do farmers and property owners in general feel about the prospect of losing that day of peace, you could put it, on Sunday?
So it's mixed. A lot of the Republican lawmakers who have opposed Sunday hunting have cited farmers from their districts saying that they want a day off from hunters on their land. But at the same time, the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau last year actually flipped its longtime opposition to lifting this ban. And that was largely because lawmakers included a new provision in this law that would include tougher trespassing penalties for hunters on farmland. And it would add a new agriculture representative to the State Game Commission. So it's mixed there, how farmers are feeling about it. But recently, with the Farm Bureau flipping its vote, it has gained some more support from Republican lawmakers in the legislature.
How will the Sundays be selected? Which Sundays? How many Sundays approximately per year? Is that addressed in Mandy Steele's bill?
So it would be every in-season Sunday, hunters could go out after game. Right now, there's a law on the books that was passed in 2019 that only allows for 3 days that were chosen by the Game Commission. One would be in rifle season, one archery season, and one whenever the Game Commission decides. But this new law would change that every in-season Sunday would be open for hunters.
How big an impact could Sunday hunting have on the deer population?
So that is what supporters are saying. I think it's unclear how big of an impact it would have right now until it goes into effect. But supporters are saying that this could really help limit deer populations, and that's actually why some farmers are supporting this now. They're saying that the deer population are out of control in Pennsylvania, and allowing for Sunday hunting could limit the population and sort of combat this damage that's being done to their crops.
And tell us, Jackson, just what kind of game, then, will hunters be allowed to go after on Sundays if this bill goes through and becomes law?
So I think the bill says something like fur-bearing game, but that includes turkey, deer, bear, at least from what I've heard from people around Harrisburg.
What kind of opposition to Sunday hunting in the past may have prolonged this debate? This has been talked about for years.
Yeah, the big one was the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. That really shut down any conversation surrounding the bill with Republicans in Harrisburg. But recently, there are still some opponents to the bill. Right now, it looks like outdoor enthusiasts are really opposed to it, saying that people should be able to have a day to hike or bike along trails in Pennsylvania without the worry of having hunters around. And some lawmakers who you talk to will still cite some religious reasons, saying that Sunday should be a day off from these recreational activities, sort of be a rest day for the family, attend church, things like that.
A lawmaker sent up a trial balloon on Sunday hunting a few years ago, relatively recent past, around 2019. There has been Sunday hunting since then, permitted on a limited basis. So what has been learned from what I'll consider a test?
So what supporters like Rep. Mandy Steele and Senator Dan Laughlin of Erie County, this pushes the 2019 push to open 3 days actually came from Dan Laughlin, and he's been a huge supporter of opening Sunday hunting. So what they both have really said, and other supporters have said, is that this families are busy. Sunday is just a day for them to be able to get out and spend time with one another. Similar to the initial intent of this law, it's a day for people to get out and enjoy Sunday weather together. They've also said farmers can combat deer from damaging crops and reduce the population of deer around the state.
How does the progress on this bill compare to years past, Jackson?
So it's pretty similar to last year. Both chambers last year, the Senate and the House, actually passed their own versions of a repeal of the Sunday hunting ban, but neither of the other chambers were able to consider the other chamber's version, so they didn't trade, right? But this year, it's pretty early into the 2-year legislative session, and one chamber has already passed this version of the bill that passed the Senate last year. So other people are telling me, and from my own viewpoint, it looks like that the Senate could be able to pass this sometime this year. I'm not sure if they'll be able to do it by the end of the month. You know, it's budget season. The state budget's due June 30th. The Senate returns next week, and they might be roped up with some of the budget stuff. But later this year, it does look like this bill could pass if they don't do it next week.
Thank you very much, Jackson White, State House reporter with LNP and Lancaster Online. More of the PCN Capitol Preview after a short break.
PCN proudly brings you coverage of the Pennsylvania State Legislature. We bring you the State House and Senate floor proceedings as they happen, unedited and complete. Our mission includes committee meetings, budget hearings, interviews with prominent legislators, and other public policy forums. PCN is your destination for the best in Pennsylvania legislative coverage on cable and PCN Select. PCN is Pennsylvania politics and policy. The year 2026 will mark the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. As Pennsylvanians, we celebrate our nation's birth and the significant role our state has played in our country's history. Watch PCN Tuesday nights at 8 to see programs honoring our Commonwealth's rich heritage. PCN, celebrating America's 250th in Pennsylvania.
Welcome back. Our guests are Greg Moreland, PA State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, and Wendell Young, President of the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1776. Wendell, we'll start with you. A bill passed the State House that could raise Pennsylvania's minimum wage. So let's get some perspective on this first. How much is minimum wage in Pennsylvania right now, and how was that figure established?
Well, the current state minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, or for a full-time worker, only a little more than $15,000 a year. And that was established in 2009. That's the last time our minimum wage has been increased. But it's important to say also that tipped workers make significantly less at, I believe it's $2.83. And, you know, the problem is that a lot of times gone by, we've all experienced not only the normal inflation during a lot of that time, but the pandemic-driven, accelerated or higher than normal inflation of recent years. And that really puts these workers in a really bad spot. There should be dignity in all work. And when you're paying people so low, you're really not giving them the value for their work. Our minimum wage here in PA is not only lower than most other states, it's lower than every one of our border states. By far, most of our 3 of our 5 border states are already at $15 or more, and a number of them have indexed that, so they don't have to wait, 17 years or longer for the legislature and the governor to address it. One of the issues with minimum wage also is a misconception that it's all a bunch of kids, teenagers, students. It's not true. While some are, majority of folks earning and being paid at the minimum wage, a poverty level of income, are adults, and many of them are women and women of color. So this disproportionately affects people that are being kept in poverty. And, that also means they qualify for a lot of public assistance. If they earned a living wage, something at or above, certainly above the poverty level, they wouldn't need so much assistance from the rest of the taxpayers, and they would also be adding more to the tax base. So, that's just a little survey of where things are at right now.
Okay, Wendell.
Before we get into what the change would be.
Yes, Wendell, thank you very much. Greg, what would you like to say to help set the stage for this discussion today?
Yeah, I think I would push back a little bit on what Wendell had said. I think the argument around minimum wage is it's an emotional argument. It's often portrayed the single mother working two jobs. And when you take a look at the empirical data that the Department of Labor and Industry has actually put out, you will see that this is really a non-issue. We are at the lowest number of folks by far making minimum wage in the Commonwealth, in our Commonwealth's history, right? And then we take a look at that number of the folks and we say, okay, well, who are these folks? Oftentimes they are teenagers or young adults. They are working their first job out in the real world. They're working part-time. They still live at home with their parents. They have no children. I mean, let's look at the statistics in which the Department of Labor and Industry provided in their 2024 minimum wage report. 66% of all folks making minimum wage were ages 16 to 24. 72% are high school graduates but no college. 85% have never been married. 94% no children. These are the statistics right here that I think really make the biggest impact. That the minimum wage individual that lives in a household with an annual income of less than $40,000 is only 9%. 9% of all minimum wage earners. But you counter that with folks making minimum wage that live in a household with an annual income of more than $150,000, and it's 42%. Right? And so we're not talking about the single mom out there. We're actually talking about folks that are coming out of high school, that are going to get their first job. I was 14 when I went to McDonald's and started working at $5.25 an hour. I didn't go there because I needed the money. It was because I wanted to work. I wanted a little bit of extra change in my pocket so I didn't have to ask mom for $20 on a Friday. But I really just wanted those skills. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be with my friends who were working there. It wasn't about the dollars, right? And I think we're seeing that. The vast majority of all folks making minimum wage, 70% of all folks making minimum wage, are servers. They make tipped money. I think many of us know folks that are servers and they're not walking home at the end of the evening with a paycheck that is equating to $7.25 an hour.
Gentlemen, before we lock horns on this issue, let's continue to get a basic understanding of minimum wage here in Pennsylvania. Now let's look at it from a wider perspective. There's a federal minimum wage, and it can be confusing to consider there's a federal minimum wage, and then Pennsylvania has its own minimum wage. Who can talk about that? Why do we do it that way?
Well, I think, the federal government has one view from a national perspective of where they would like the lowest wage to be. But each state,
and what do they have it set at, Greg?
They have it set at $7.25. And Pennsylvania, we had a major increase back in 2009, I think we went from $7.15 to $7.25 to align. It was, a 10-cent increase back in 2009 to align that with the federal minimum wage, and that's where we've stayed thus far. States have the right to increase that amount should they choose so, and I think we've seen here in Pennsylvania that the market has responded to many of the factors and driven the market minimum wage really into the $10, $11 range at this point.
So Wendell, how do you feel about that? It was in fact an increase for minimum wage in 2009, but it was only 10 cents.
It wasn't enough. And, we have a closely divided legislature, have for a long time. Conservatives, Republicans mostly, have at both the federal and state level been the opponents to this. It's kind of ironic that they are, considering they're also the ones that want to cut aid to people who are working poor. They want to cut Medicaid. They want to cut other federal and state programs to assist people who are working poor, while they themselves want to keep these people in poverty. Now, I want to go back to something that Greg said. Statistics are always fun to mess with. He made it sound like 72% of these minimum wage earners are youngsters. 72% of the people 16 to 24, last I heard, 18 is the age of adulthood. So he's including a lot of adults in those numbers. The actual numbers, and he knows them, I'm sure he knows them, is 82% of all minimum wage earners in Pennsylvania are adults. And the reasons that he stated why they don't deserve more money is probably the reason for their condition. He must have been fortunate to not have to worry about earning money, but there's a lot of teenagers and young adults who need to take care of themselves because their families are also poor and working poor. Or maybe they're no longer with a family, or maybe they didn't have a family, or maybe they lost their parents, and they do need a responsible, fair living wage. But when you have overwhelming majority of the people earning minimum wage, keep in mind that statistic is at the minimum wage. There's a whole lot of people that are still being kept in the poverty level of between the minimum wage and a number much higher than that, higher than $15 an hour, that aren't even included those statistics. So for him to make it sound like this is the lowest amount of people ever. In Pennsylvania, it's nearly 100,000 people at the minimum wage. There's far more just slightly above it, but still working in poverty. And it's important to note that the minimum wage is just the minimum. And yeah, there are employers that pay over it. But if your minimum is so low, the base for many others isn't going to be much higher either. And, there is a lot of peer-reviewed, published research that shows that raising the minimum wage is not only a moral case to do it, but there's good economic data. Because when people, I think Henry Ford taught us all, and we all learned about it in elementary school, that he understood that you had to raise wages if people were going to buy his cars. If American businesses, big and small, want people to be able to afford to buy the products and services they produce, then you have to have at least wages that are at or above the poverty level. And that's what this whole discussion's about. And so not only does it create more of a multiplier effect within the communities where the wages are raised, because the lower people earn in money, the more likely they are to spend all that money locally in the same businesses that are employing a lot of them. So this is a huge economic benefit to the communities in which the wage is raised. It also brings in more tax revenue. It helps move more people off of public assistance, which is what the rest of the taxpayers are paying for. It actually helps raise more taxes for those same services. So I don't think there's really any arguments that have ever held up. Lots of states, the majority of the states have raised their minimum wage. A lot of cities have raised it beyond their state minimums. And there really is an overwhelming amount of evidence that these communities didn't suffer the doom and gloom that Greg and others like him say they are. There was no widespread job losses. There was no widespread, closing of businesses. There's an old saying, a rising tide floats all boats. And what the overwhelming abundance of research shows is that when you raise the minimum wage, it has that effect. It's a rising tide that floats all boats, and it improves our economy. And what the House bill here that's being considered, House Bill 1549, I think is the one that we're talking about. It deals with some of the issues of immediate impact by tiering it and phasing it. So cities like Philadelphia, the larger cities, will have a $15 an hour minimum wage, medium-sized cities a $12, smaller counties a $10, and these things get phased in over some time. with indexing kicking in 2029. So you won't see an immediate jarring impact by doing it this way.
Greg,
now, I happen
Greg,
to yeah, go ahead.
Wendell, let's give Greg a chance. And let's continue, gentlemen, just to understand the current law some more before we talk more about that bill. And Wendell, I'm glad you brought it up. We're going to explore it in more detail later. What kind of workers must be paid minimum wage, according to current law, Greg?
I think it's pretty much all workers except there's
a handful of exceptions.
Agricultural workers in some capacities. I believe there are.
If you work for tips, how about that?
If you work for tips, if you're a server, it's the $2.83 an hour. I believe there's another small subset of folks in there as well. But we also have to remember our nonprofits when we're talking about minimum wage as well. There are a large number of intellectual disability folks that work for nonprofits. They do that because they must be paid, and they're paying them for their work, right? But they're not out there selling things that are making tons of money back for that nonprofit. And so also a consideration when talking about minimum wage, that it is not just the workers making money for their mortgages and rents. It's also folks that are need some work, and folks out there and nonprofits out there have designed their businesses around that to provide them some opportunity to do that work. And so I think when we look at who is making that minimum wage. There are a decent amount of adults and young adults who are making minimum wage when they're starting out at work. I think the data would also reflect that they're the first to lose their jobs in case of an increase in labor costs to a business. Right? We're going to see business owners reduce hours. We're going to see them hire fewer workers, automate services where possible. They're going to focus on doing more with less. And they simply are just not going to hire those that don't come to the door with some sort of skills already. Let's think about folks re-entering the workforce from prison or incarceration. Let's think about those with drug and alcohol issues that may have ended up in the criminal justice system as well, and they need a second chance. Oftentimes they have to start out a little bit lower than where they may have left the workforce. And so these are big issues. Indexing certainly an issue for our folks. We think that the General Assembly and our elected officials get paid well over $100,000 a year. They should make tough decisions. They shouldn't have a free out in just saying, well, it's connected to CPI, and so we're going to wash our hands of this issue.
Wendell, why is Pennsylvania's minimum wage significantly lower than neighboring states?
Because our legislatures failed to act. If you look at our political division since the last time it was raised, even before that, we've been closely divided. And conservatives, it's hard to get bills on any issue through the legislature and to a governor's desk for signature when you're that closely divided, because if you lose one or two votes on either side, things tend to sit for a long time. And so this, like many other things, has not been able to get through the legislature. And the business interests are very powerful in convincing people that, people who work for a living shouldn't earn a living wage, that they should be kept in poverty. I mean, listen to the list Greg just went through. The people who we want to work, the people we want to get that second start in life, the people that we don't want to be a burden on the taxpayers and live on the dole, as they used to say. We also hear the conservatives and the business community say, not all businesses, but some, that these people should be kept in poverty and they shouldn't be able to dig themselves out of a hole. And let's not forget, that's also someone else can afford a bigger house, at the shore, or a bigger boat, or a more expensive car. It's because the evidence is that when other jurisdictions, states and cities have raised the minimum wage, it's increased and improved positive economic behavior. So I think it's rather selfish and narrow and and wrong argument to say that we're all going to be better off if we keep more people in poverty.
Wendell, keep the floor for a moment. Let's consider minimum wage in bordering states. For example, New York and New Jersey. Can you tell me how they compare to Pennsylvania's minimum wage? How much per hour, in other words?
New Jersey is $15.49 an hour. And they do have indexing. New York is $15.50, but on Long Island and New York City, it's $16.50.
How about
Delaware?
How about Ohio? Do you know, Wendell?
Ohio is $10.70, and it's indexed. Maryland is $15, and West Virginia, who I don't think should be our model, because I think we're better than West Virginia. I think is $8.75. And we're even far behind that.
Greg, what does it mean to business in Pennsylvania when neighboring states, as we've been discussing, have a significantly higher minimum wage?
I mean, it's a consideration, but you also have to look at the cost of living in those states as well. I think New York, New Jersey, even parts of Maryland, certainly not what the Commonwealth is, and certainly I don't think that's a framework in which we should try to replicate. Go live in New York City and try to make $16.50, and your rent's $2,000 for a shoebox apartment, and that's 300 square feet. I mean, that's not Pennsylvania, right? And so we need a different mindset. We need a different way of thinking. We need different laws. I think what we've seen in the aftermath of the pandemic is that wages have risen higher than any other time in history, quite honestly, for the worker. And so this minimum wage argument is kind of this boogeyman argument that we need to do something about it. We're talking about such a small percentage of the population and taking up a lot of air in the room, yet we're not talking about how to provide family sustaining jobs and great wages to many folks, right? How to get them into those jobs that really are going to take care of their families, right? Not every job is designed to be a family sustaining job. It's just not simply, the economy does not work that way.
Gentlemen, take a break just for a minute. We'll get back to our discussion about minimum wage. But right now, we're going to look at program notes for PCN. America's 250th birthday is next year. We have 3 programs in a row to help celebrate. The first is about the role played by the Spangler Farm at the Battle of Gettysburg. Then we turn to the first oil well in Pennsylvania. And finally, Philadelphia's Boathouse Row. They're all on Tuesday starting at 8 p.m. For more details, go to PCNTV.com. On the issues is about federal funding cuts to universities. The president of Susquehanna University, Jonathan Green, gives his point of view at 7 p.m. Then right after that, we'll have the Secretary of Community and Economic Development, Rick Seiger. He'll have the latest news from his department on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Its history tells the story of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. First opened in 1879, its goal was to assimilate Native American children, and that's on Wednesday at 9 p.m. You can watch this show and all our public affairs programming free of charge by visiting PCNSelect.com. And while you're there, you can download our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is Everything Pennsylvania. We're a 501c3 nonprofit television network that relies on viewers like you. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. All right, we're going to resume our discussion about minimum wage. And Wendell Young, I'm going to give the floor back to you because a few minutes ago you opened the door on this recent activity in Pennsylvania's House. Representative Dawkins has a bill. It passed the full House, and it raises minimum wage based on county population. What do you suppose is the merit of that approach in your mind, Wendell?
Well, the cost of living in Philadelphia is higher than most, if not all, other areas of Pennsylvania. So it's important, like other states have done, to have some tiering within the state. Now, the argument from conservatives and some in the business community is that, in these rural areas, you need maybe not to go as far as fast. But, I beg to differ on that. I mean, I'm glad Representative Dawkins got this to where it is now. And I understand the compromise is necessary to get there. But the reality is, there's a perception that the poor people, and I'm going to put it bluntly here, the poor people on welfare are all in the big cities. And that's not true. There's a huge population of working poor in our rural communities, and they're never going to get lifted up if you keep them poor by not only keeping the current minimum wage in place, but not providing them a better opportunity to get value from their work and to help lift themselves up and lift their own communities up, because the lower those wages in some of these communities, in many of these communities, the harder it is for the communities economically to climb out. This isn't just about the individuals, it's about the whole community. So while I applaud Representative Dawkins, he's got a real uphill battle here, and he's done a great job at it along with his Democrats in the caucus. I think really, to get back to some things before the break that Greg had said, I find it really, and I am going to use one of those words, disingenuous, completely unfair, that at a time the Republicans and many of the biggest business leaders in the country, people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, have led these efforts on Doge to cut the programs that help train people for better jobs, to cut the support systems for working poor, to cut dollars for education and research and training doctors and nurses and all kinds of things. That someone could sit here on this show or anywhere else and say, oh, we don't need to raise minimum wage. People just need to go out and get the training and get better jobs. You can't have it both ways. And, people, regardless of what their situation in life is, if they show up and go to work, they deserve to earn a fair and living wage. And the government has a role here to play. We spend a lot of money in government to make sure that we have safety nets for the poor and the working poor. But why not also make sure that one of those safety nets is that if your employer is not going to treat you fairly, then the government's going to make sure so the rest of the taxpayers don't have to pay for all the other benefits they get. And that's what this is really about. It's about equity, fairness. And there's none of these businesses that can't afford to do the right things, because overwhelming amount, it's over 90% of all the money paid in increased wages for the people at the bottom gets spent back in the very businesses that these people work in.
Greg, let me get your reaction to Dawkins' plan, but first let me provide some detail on what he's proposing. Under the bill, most counties over 210,000 population would get $12 an hour. However, if you live in Philadelphia, and obviously there are more people there, then you get $15 an hour.
I think it's very confusing. The bill itself does not outline whether or not it's where the business is located or where the work is performed. This could be really, really confusing for many of our business owners. When we talk small business, federally the definition is 500 or fewer employees. Here at NFIB, our average employer has 10 employees, right? And so they don't have an HR department, a compliance officer, an attorney on staff. And so when you make these complex rules and regulations and inside of these bills, it's very confusing for our business owners and how to effectuate that and what to pay that individual and to ensure that they're not out of compliance, right? And so when we're talking a policy, we like to see uniformity across the board. We like to see one standard, a federal and state matching on those standards. We don't like the gray areas when it comes to laws, rules, and regulations. And I think that's what we're seeing here. It was an interesting mix of class of counties in there of who got what number and what representatives stood up and said, hey, wait, maybe we should be over here rather than over here. But it didn't seem like it was backed by any necessarily empirical data or it was just kind of a feeling.
Wendell, do you see any confusion resulting from this plan? Go ahead.
I think it's extremely clear. And I don't speak for Representative Dawkins. I'm pretty sure if he were in this show right now, what he would say is, look, if you're not sure how this works, then let's just make it the same rate for everybody. And I'm pretty sure Representative Dawkins would have liked a higher than $15 rate. But the $15 rate, the $12 rate, the $10 rate, this so-called confusion is because you need bipartisan support, and conservatives don't want to raise this at all. Republicans generally, not all, there are, I don't want to be speaking in absolutes, don't want to raise it all. So it was to accommodate the same people who don't want to raise it at all. The very people that are saying, oh, this is confusing, are the reason why it's confusing. If it's so confusing, let's just make it like $18 an hour for everybody, so everybody will earn a living wage. But what you have in front of you right now is the result of compromises to get it through the legislature.
Now, here's an interesting feature of this bill, gentlemen, and I'm sure this stands in stark contrast to the last time minimum wage was raised in 2009. We've already acknowledged it was only raised 10 cents an hour. This bill has cost of living adjustments in it, and that seems to add a new wrinkle to this discussion. Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. As I previously mentioned, I think it's the easy way out for our legislators. They get paid a significant salary, some of the most highest paid politicians in the country. And so we think, and it's our position, that they get paid to make grown-up decisions. They get paid on each individual bill that comes before them. They get paid to make their decision on those, and sometimes they're tough decisions. We don't think that there should be an easy way out, that they can simply hide behind a CPI increase and say, well, it wasn't me, or look at what we did. It's not. It shouldn't be that way. They get paid too much to not make decisions.
Wendell, cost of living adjustments to minimum wage, COLAs. Did you see that coming?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's been the trend. Many states that have increased their minimum wage have moved to that because they've experienced the same problem where because of inability the legislature to come to an agreement, years would go by before making adjustments. And actually, it leaves the state and the communities and the workers behind. It has a negative effect on economic activity. It does. You don't get the multiplier effect and the beneficial multiplier effect. So this is a way to not let this become a wedge issue, to not let it be used by different groups to prevent anything from happening at all. And it also takes it away from becoming a fundraising tool. Legislators, both parties, will grab issues and used as a fundraising tool. And I think it's something that some Republicans do a lot with a lot of fear mongering, like you've heard here about, how bad it's going to be if people earn a minimum wage that can actually allow them to live. And so I think it's the right and responsible thing to do. There's a lot of things that get indexed. But boy, when it comes to making sure that people work for a living, we're not talking about people that don't work for a living. We're talking about people that work for a living, can be taken care of. We index, for example, Social Security. I think a lot of the same people, including legislators, in the Capitol, when they go to collect their Social Security, are going to be pretty damn glad that it's indexed. And for those legislators that don't think that's a good idea, then they should maybe, not take that indexing when it happens to their own Social Security. And for those that don't think we should raise the minimum wage, maybe they should start working for minimum wage, Pennsylvania's minimum wage, and see how they like it.
Here's a question for Greg. Like the House, the Senate has a similar plan that raises minimum wage with, again, COLA, cost of living adjustments. Now, how significant is this agreement between these two chambers? Does this indicate something's going to happen here?
No, I don't believe so. I think we see proposals come out every single day in both chambers. I think we're in the time period. They ran it last week in the House because it was Union Week last week. They ran a bunch of other bills as well, where the timing was right for the Democrat caucus to run. I don't believe we've seen any action on the Senate side. I don't believe the appetite is there. I think those folks realize that the market has responded. Folks are being paid the wages that they're earning. And, if we wanted to just get everybody out of poverty, Larry, I think we would just raise the minimum wage to $50 and call it a day.
Wendell, how would you compare the Senate's plan to the House's? I understand the Senate wants to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Well, I like that. Raise everybody's to at least 15. I would go further if I were in the legislature, but I do think that it has a better shot now than it has in the past. I think every year that goes by, it has a better shot because inflation's taken a bigger bite out of everybody's pay every year. And there's another thing here. In recent years, I don't want to say every, poll after poll, credible polls are showing well over 80% of all Pennsylvanians want this done. Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, moderates, all combined. And it's getting harder and harder for anybody that opposes this to have a good reason to say they oppose it. So I think the issue is going to be what form does it take, not whether or not it happens. We spend a lot of time. We have a political legislative team like Greg does. We spend a lot of time talking to legislators, and when you talk to even some of the harder Republicans on this issue, they acknowledge it's long overdue to be fixed because it's broken. It does need to be fixed.
Now, Wendell, I understand.
The fact that, let me just say, Larry.
Go ahead.
You keep hearing over and over again from those who oppose this that, not that many people are affected by it anymore. Well, if that's true, then go ahead and raise it. It's not a big deal. Why treat those remaining people so poorly?
Let's turn to Greg for this next question. I understand this Senate plan increases penalties for something called wage theft, and I have a hunch you can refresh us on what that is.
Wage theft as far as for tipped workers?
Well, within the context of this discussion, maybe you can help, Wendell.
Can you repeat that again?
Wage theft. I understand that the Senate plan increases penalties for what they're calling wage theft. This phrase has come up in our discussions before. I figured one of you would know about it. Enlighten us, Wendell, if you can.
Wage theft is huge. This is where employers will require people to work but not get paid for it. And the people who obviously it doesn't happen in the union environment because we're there to represent the workers and enforce labor contracts. But for workers who don't have a voice, who are afraid of being fired if they speak up, being asked to stick around a little bit every day or more than a little bit. I think there's the Inquirer just a few months ago talked about how domestic workers are often abused. We know that happens in a lot of industries that Greg talked about earlier that are exempted from the minimum wage, but it also happens in a lot of industries where people aren't. We know when we're out organizing, for example, whether it's people that work in plants or retail, what they'll tell us stories about. I was paid for 8 hours, but I worked 9 hours several days a week, but I only got paid for 8. They don't have anybody to go to. And so the penalties right now are little or nothing for employers that do that. And it's really hard to expect the federal government these days to enforce much of that when they were understaffed before DOGE. Now DOGE fired a lot of the workers that go out at the Department of Labor and do that kind of investigation. So I think Pennsylvania is spot on right now, making the penalties higher and investigating and enforcing it.
Greg, maybe you can help me with this variation on the Senate bill. It has to do with ensuring that tips are the sole property of the employee. So that begs the question, just how do businesses handle tips these days in an increasingly cashless society?
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult.
In other words, do they pool them?
Some business owners and folks, managers have tried to do it in the past. We do believe that those tips do belong with the employee, and many of our business owners have developed their business models in that way. It comes down to whether or not there's a swipe fee on when an individual has a $100 bill and they tip 20% and there's a $20 tip there. There's a swipe fee on that $120, right? And some managers and business owners were trying to take back the swipe fee out of the $20, which should be the employees. Department of Labor and Industry said absolutely not, no way. Shouldn't be able to do that. We're in agreement that is the employees' money, and we don't think that the managers, the business owners, and folks that shouldn't be getting tipped, should be receiving those dollars. Those dollars should be going to those folks. And again, that $20 right there off of that one table and that one day, that's the reason they're making $2.83 an hour and they're not making the $15 an hour. Go speak to a server and ask them if they like House Bill 1549.
Wendell, let's explore some of the traditional arguments about minimum wage here. And one of them is if minimum wage goes up, jobs are lost. Explore that briefly.
Well, first of all, the evidence is overwhelming the opposite. And you can look at places like Oregon, Washington State, New York City, just anywhere you look where they've raised the wage, it just hasn't happened. In fact, you might remember one of the biggest wage increases in our lifetimes in minimum wage federally happened during the Clinton administration. And you couldn't have had a better economic period you did not have a better economic period in our country ever compared to those almost 8 full years of the Clinton administration. So the evidence is overwhelming. Now, there is evidence that when you stagger or phase in, it helps employers adjust. And really, it's the small employers that we're really talking about here that are going to feel it before they get the benefit of it. Because what all the research, and I'm talking about peer-reviewed and published research, the credible stuff, shows is that, this has an economic benefit, including to the businesses that are subject to it. But by phasing it in, you make sure they get the benefit of that as it's being phased in. And because there's a multiplier effect, people, the less people make, the more likely it is they're going to spend the money in the community where they live and work. And all the other wage earners in the community do the same. Unlike people at the other end of the socioeconomic ladder who might invest in the stock market or buy a bigger boat or a more expensive car. That money's not all, most of it not even being spent in the community in which they live and work. So employers actually benefit from it, especially small employers and medium-sized employers. The trick is, and this bill 1549 does this, phases things in so that employers can adjust, they can receive and feel the benefits at the same time it's being phased in. And so I just really think the evidence is overwhelming that the doom and gloom that's predicted, it's never actually happened. I really just think it's suspect.
Greg, what do you think? The position is if minimum wage goes up, jobs are lost.
Yeah, I think we commissioned a study, a third-party independent study several years ago on previous House Bill 1500, very similar in nature to House Bill 1549 minus the locality differences. And what we found there is that it would end up costing the Commonwealth about 101,000 jobs and about $14 billion in economic output, right? And what that means is, going back to my earlier statements, that business owners are going to look to reduce hours, automate. They're going to hire less, right? The worker who worked 30 hours part-time at X dollars is now going to work 25 hours at X plus their increase, right? And so they're not actually going to gain money in the long run. We keep referring to places that have extremely high cost of living: Oregon, Washington, New York City, California, New York, New Jersey. I don't think that's what we want to strive for here in our economic conditions. I don't think that's what our workers want. I don't think that's the cost of housing, the price of goods and services that we desire. I think that all of those things need to be taken into account. And quite honestly, right now, if you're working a minimum wage job, you have chosen to work at that minimum wage job. In this climate, in this economic condition, you have chosen to work there. There are jobs out there. If you want to make more, you can.
Wendell, if minimum wage goes up, doesn't it stand to reason that prices will go up too?
Well, prices have gone up without the minimum wage going up, and they've gone up at higher than normal rates in recent years. So I don't think those price increases, haven't had anything to do with a raise in minimum wage, because we haven't raised the minimum wage in Pennsylvania in about 16, 17 years. I find it hard to believe that what we heard at the beginning of the show from Greg was that this doesn't really affect many people. But we just heard an alleged study that said that it's going to have this huge economic impact on Pennsylvania. Can't have it both ways. I don't think what he's talking about was actually research. I think it was a position paper. I keep saying when you look at peer-reviewed research, published research, that's the gold standard for research. Everything else is just someone's position paper. And so I don't think there's a lot of credibility in the information that you were just provided. What is credible is the time-tested idea that, if you raise the floor, people will spend more on the goods and services in their community. That will bring in more business for the businesses in that community. That is a way of saying that has a percolator or multiplier effect. Those concepts have been extensively studied and researched scientifically and published and peer-reviewed and published. I think you ought to look at the credible research on this. And, it's no different than what we all learned as kids in elementary school when we were taught the lesson about Henry Ford I mentioned earlier. You got to be able to earn enough money to buy the Model T. Otherwise, he wouldn't sell many Model Ts. That concept is as true today as it was back then. And 16 years without an increase in the floor is way, way too long. And there's no excuse to hold people in that kind of poverty. And I would suggest, if anybody thinks it's a good idea, that they should go and stand in those people's shoes for a while and earn that themselves. You won't think it's a very good idea.
Gentlemen, we only have a few minutes left on our program, so just to summarize here, we've talked about 2 legislative plans to raise the minimum wage. One's in the Senate, one's in the House. One is, in fact, passed the House, and it will go to the Senate. And then, as you know, add this component, the state budget itself is due at the end of June. So might minimum wage get linked to the budget and caught up in that maelstrom at the last minute? Greg, what do you think?
We're hopeful not. If it is going to occur, I think it is tied to the budget. There are economic conditions there in which kind of tie it to the budget. And so I always think it will be a budgetary time discussion should it happen.
What do you think is going to happen in the coming weeks, Wendell? I know you can't say for sure.
Oh, you're right. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. And we have a way here in Pennsylvania of getting nothing done or very little done often because we're so closely divided politically. But, this issue is an economic issue, and there's way more pluses than minuses, so we ought to do it. It's a fairness issue from a moral perspective. There's no reason to keep people subjected to poverty who have to rely on these jobs. It's a political issue. And, let's face it, politicians pay attention to polls. 82% or more in nearly every poll of Pennsylvanians, Republicans and Democrats alike, independents, want this done. Wendell. And they want to go higher. So they should do this, and they should do it now.
Thank you very much, Wendell. Our guests have been Greg Moreland, PA State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, and Wendell Young, President of the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1776. Thank you both for being here. PCN's Ellen France talked to Representative Leanne Kruger about animal trafficking.
Welcome to our program. You've proposed a bill involving wildlife trafficking. Can you explain what wildlife trafficking is?
So wildlife trafficking is the sale of an animal's part. So we think about elephants. Over 15,000 elephants are killed every year in Africa for their tusks in poaching activities. And so the bill that I've drafted, House Bill 994, seeks to end the demand for and the sale of trafficked animal parts within the borders of Pennsylvania.
Under your bill, what would the punishment be for those who get caught trafficking animals?
So currently we've drafted civil penalties in this bill. So first violation, the fine would be $250 or less, not to exceed $5,000. Second or subsequent offense, where the total value of the annual part is $250 or more, the fine would not exceed $10,000.
I know you mentioned elephants, but what are some other examples of animals that are trafficked, whether it be throughout Pennsylvania or just the country?
So the bill specifies animals that are most at risk for trafficking. And so it's a pretty long list of species that are covered in this bill, but it includes baleen whale, bonobo, cheetah, chimpanzee, dolphin, elephant, giraffe, gorilla, hippo, jaguar, leopard, lion, mammoth, and mastodon, because sometimes elephant ivory is actually passed off as something that they're calling mammoth or mastodon, but it actually didn't come from those animals. Orangutan, panda, pangolin, polar bear, ray, rhinoceros, sea turtle, shark, tiger, and walrus. And so those are the animals. It's the current list of the animals that are most at risk for trafficking according to Humane World of Animals, and they would be protected in this bill.
Do other states have legislation like this in place?
Yes, this language follows its model language that has passed in a number of other states. There are currently federal laws in effect as well, but the federal laws don't have anything to do with the sale of animal parts within the borders of Pennsylvania. So essentially, this bill closes a loophole and takes what's already illegal at the federal level and in many other states and prevents the sale of these endangered animal parts in Pennsylvania.
All of the animals you mentioned are not native to Pennsylvania, so why do you think the people in Pennsylvania should be concerned about the welfare of these animals?
Well, as a mom, I grew up taking my son to the Philadelphia Zoo, and he would learn about orangutans and the threat to their habitat from palm oil, where they were tearing down habitat by going to the Philadelphia Zoo. And so I think, while these are not animals that are native to Pennsylvania, many of them we can see in our great Pennsylvania zoos, and they're animals that we have grown to love. I believe that most Pennsylvanians wouldn't want to be contributing to the poaching of elephants for their tusks or the poaching of rhinos for their horns if they knew that the product that they're buying was the result of poaching. And so we're seeking to educate people about these animals and what's actually happening in Pennsylvania right now with this bill, as well as preventing the trafficking. And I don't know if you were able to see the report, but Humane World for Animals actually released the results of an investigation at a press conference here at the Capitol just 2 weeks ago. And what they found was alarming results. They visited over 60 locations in Pennsylvania, and they found over 383 ivory items from elephants for sale in Pennsylvania right now. They also looked at online auctions and found significant sales as well. And so this is actually already happening in Pennsylvania, and we want to make sure that we protect these at-risk species.
Lastly, where is your bill in the legislative process currently?
So the bill came out of the Judiciary Committee with a very strong bipartisan vote, 25-1. It's scheduled for second consideration tomorrow, Tuesday, and we're hoping it'll be up for final passage next week.
Representative Leanne Kruger, thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks to Ellen for that interview. A reminder before we go about On the Issues. It'll be about federal funding cuts to universities. The president of Susquehanna University, Jonathan Green, gives his point of view Wednesday at 7 p.m. Then right after that, we'll have the Secretary of Community and Economic Development, Rick Seiger, with the latest news from his department. He'll be here on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.